Welcome to Session 3. The focus of this session is lesson plans. First, we'll look at the lesson plan forms and the handout explaining the lesson plan components. Then we will look at examples of actual lesson plans. After we inspect the samples, we'll go over the rules, such as the number of detailed lesson plans that must be written before moving to the less detailed form, etc. Now let's take a look at the first slide. Find Handbook page 20. It is a blank of the lesson plan form, just like the one on this slide. It has all of the components that clinical teachers are to address as they prepare their lesson plans. I send this lesson plan form to my clinical teachers electronically so that they have a template to work from as they prepare their lesson plans. Inform your clinical teachers that they are to use this form for their detailed lesson plans. Let them know that by including fewer details for each lesson plan component, it will work for their less detailed, shorter lesson plans as well. For the next slide, find Handbook page 21. This page is information about each of the lesson plan components. You will want to review this information with your clinical teachers. Add any information that you feel would be pertinent concerning any of these components. Tell students that they are to script out what they intend to say for each of the lesson cycle components under introduction and instructional steps, as well as what they plan on doing throughout the lesson to keep students engaged and involved. Tell students the purpose of scripting is to set themselves up for success as they begin to assume responsibility for instruction. Tell them that during an actual lesson, they will of course not say things exactly like their script, but having thought it through first in detail will help with their delivering confidence, plus the cooperating teacher will be able to see what they plan on saying and doing. Make sure that they understand they are to address all of these components for each lesson plan they compose for both detailed and less detailed shorter plans. Tell students to write NA if one of the components is not appropriate for a particular lesson. For example, a lesson may not have independent practice or guided practice. Also note that the components under introduction may appear in any order depending on what is appropriate for that lesson. Tell them that their cooperating teacher will give permission to transition to the less detailed, shorter lesson plans. Inform them that they also have the option of composing their own format for a lesson plan as long as all of the lesson cycle components are included. Remind the clinical teachers that the lesson plan form on page 20 in the handbook will also work for less detailed, shorter plans by simply including less detail for each component. Now we will inspect 3 sample lesson plans written by actual clinical teachers. They are not perfect, but will serve as examples of the types of lesson plans you will actually see. These samples are part of the miscellaneous handouts that you printed before beginning this session. Pause here until you have the 3 sample lesson plans. This slide displays the first page of the 5th grade math detailed lesson plan on dot plots. Looking at your handout of this lesson plan, note the lesson cycle components that will be included in each lesson plan. They are objectives, TEKS, materials, motivation, prior learning, statement of objective purpose, which are listed under introduction, model, guided practice, and independent practice, which are listed under instructional steps, closure, which includes review and future learning, lesson extension and or modification, and assessment of learning. Remember that the components under introduction may appear on a lesson plan in any order that is appropriate for the given lesson. Also remember that there may be components that are labeled as NA, especially under instructional steps if they are not appropriate for that lesson. On this lesson plan, note the scripting and examples which set the clinical teacher up for success. As stated earlier, this amount of detail makes the clinical teachers think in advance about what they will say and do for each lesson cycle component. Also, it was already noted that it will not be verbatim when they are actually teaching the lesson. The next slide is the sample lesson plan on the Earth's rotation. Point out to your clinical teachers that this lesson plan has the same lesson cycle components as the previous one, but it has a tad less detail for each component. Looking at the next slide, you see a short lesson plan. This sample is a 5th grade science lesson. Notice that it still has all of the lesson cycle components, but has even less detail than the previous lesson plan. It is definitely a good idea to make the 3 sample lesson plans available to your clinical teachers. Tell them that these are actual lesson plans written by other clinical teachers, so they're not perfect. In summary, remind your clinical teachers of several things. First, all lesson cycle components should be addressed on each lesson plan. Record an NA if the component is not appropriate. Secondly, as the clinical teachers progress through the semester and gain experience, less and less detail may be needed for success, and this will depend on the individual clinical teacher. Thirdly, remind the clinical teachers that their cooperating teacher must always be on board with the amount of detail that is included on their daily lesson plans. The next 2 slides in this session are from the handout entitled Lesson Plan Requirements. Find the handout with the same title. It's one of the miscellaneous handouts that you printed for this session. This handout has detailed information about the requirements or rules for writing lesson plans. It is not included in the handbook, which contains more general information on lesson planning. For this reason, I included in the mentoring folder for cooperating teachers, so you will see and hear about this handout again in the last audio session. My clinical teachers also receive a copy of this handout at their seminar on lesson planning. Looking at this handout, find the section near the top entitled If Cooperating Teacher Has 2 or More Preparations. Note that the clinical teacher will prepare at least 4 detailed lesson plans for each of the first 2 subject areas or blocks of time for which the clinical teacher assumes responsibility. After successfully teaching these 4 lessons in each of the first 2 subject areas taught by the clinical teacher, the cooperating teacher will grant permission to progress to a less detailed, shorter form in these 2 subject areas only. For the remainder of the semester, the clinical teacher will continue with the less detailed, shorter plan in these subject areas. Note, less detailed, shorter lesson plan simply means writing less detail for each lesson plan component. For each new subject area or block of time that is now added, 1 detailed lesson plan is required for the newly added subject area or block of time. If the clinical teacher is experiencing success, the cooperating teacher will give his or her approval to progress to a less detailed, shorter lesson plan. As the semester progresses, the amount of detail decreases depending on the amount of detail each clinical teacher personally needs in order to be successful. The cooperating teacher must be in full agreement. The pacing schedule should be arranged so that the clinical teacher is on the less detailed, shorter plan for all subjects by the time he or she is in full responsibility. Exceptions would be if a clinical teacher on his or her own chooses to write more detail for a subject area, or if a clinical teacher is struggling and needs to stay, as advised by the clinical teacher or by you, the university supervisor, on a more detailed lesson plan in order to experience success. The next section is if cooperating teacher has 1 preparation. Note that it states, this model generally begins with the follow me approach. This approach requires the clinical teacher to pre-plan with the cooperating teacher, write out a detailed lesson plan based on this pre-planning session, observe the cooperating teacher model how to teach this lesson, make needed adjustments to the prepared plan while observing the cooperating teacher teach this lesson, and finally, independently teach the lesson to another class. When the clinical teacher is ready, he or she plans and teaches his or her lessons with less and less guidance. The clinical teacher will write at least 8 detailed lesson plans for the subject area taught. Then, with approval from the cooperating teacher, the clinical teacher will transition to a less detailed, shorter lesson plan for this subject period or block of time. From then on, the clinical teacher will include the amount of detail that is personally needed to be successful. Depending on how successful the clinical teacher has been, the cooperating teacher may approve the less detailed, shorter lesson plan for the first full responsibility and thereafter. Under options available for the lesson plan form, you already know about the template for the handbook page 20, but there is a note in bold print. It says, Some school districts have online lesson planning programs that their teachers must use. Although it is ideal for clinical teachers to stay with our lesson plan format, it is acceptable to transfer to an alternative format after the initial detailed lesson plans have been written. More details should be added to the district's format if possible. Also note that some school districts also provide teachers with prepackaged lesson plans, and the teachers told everything to say and everything to do. In this case, have the clinical teachers prepare the initial 4 or 8 detailed lesson plans on our forms. After this requirement has been satisfactorily met, the clinical teachers may make copies of the prepackaged lesson plans provided by the school district. They are to label our lesson cycle components on these copies. If a component, such as stating the lesson objective or establishing purpose, is missing, for example, the clinical teacher is to add it by writing it on the lesson plan itself. Under subject areas or blocks of time that do not require a detailed lesson plan, there are examples of when lesson plans may not be required in the elementary grades. For all grades, you are basically empowering the cooperating teachers to decide whether a subject area or block of time should have a detailed lesson plan or not. Under guidelines for submitting lesson plans to the cooperating teacher, make it clear that by Friday of the second week of the clinical teaching semester, the clinical teacher should submit all lesson plans for the following week to his or her cooperating teacher. This policy continues for the remainder of the semester. These lesson plans that have been read and initialed by the cooperating teacher will be filed in the clinical teaching notebook by the clinical teacher. You will be spot checking these lesson plans every time you observe a lesson. As you spot check lesson plans, it is a good idea to initial the specific component from each lesson plan that you chose to thoroughly read. This will assure the clinical teacher that you are indeed monitoring what is written on these lesson plans. Discuss any issues that are spotted with the clinical teacher during the follow-up conference. Here are 4 issues or questions that surface nearly every semester concerning lesson planning. The first one, so when circumstances are beyond the control of the clinical teacher, be flexible with the Friday deadline for lesson plans. For example, perhaps the cooperating teacher meets with the clinical teacher late in the week to discuss the following week's lesson plans, therefore not giving the clinical teacher adequate time to prepare by Friday all of the lesson plans for the following week. In this case, Monday may be the fairest solution to this problem. Tactfully coordinate the solution with the cooperating teacher, though. In elementary, another issue often comes up. If a grade level meets 1 day a week to prepare lesson plans for the following week, should a clinical teacher use these team plans that are generated? Here's a suggestion. Tell the clinical teacher to participate in these planning sessions, but to go off on his or her own and adapt these lesson plans to follow or meet our requirements. Also, another issue that often comes up is when there's more than one clinical teacher in a grade level. The question is if it's okay for these clinical teachers to plan together, and the answer is absolutely yes. However, after the clinical teachers plan together, they are to go their separate ways and write out their own lesson plans. It's always interesting that even though the activity itself may be the same, the clinical teachers will differ in their sequence of instructional steps or just their overall approach to teaching the lesson. In elementary, another issue that may or may not come up is this. If a grade level, for example, divides up the planning for the various subject areas and then shares the lesson plans with all the other teachers on the team, what is the clinical teacher to do regarding these shared plans? Here's my answer. I tell the clinical teacher to take the lesson plans prepared by other teachers and adapt them to our lesson plan format. I remind them to be sure to address all appropriate lesson cycle components. Also, I remind them to add to or delete so as to personalize the lesson plans. This will give the clinical teacher a sense of ownership and therefore ensure that the clinical teacher is more successful. These are just a few of the more common issues that we face each semester with lesson planning. For all others, handle them in the most professional manner possible, making sure the clinical teachers are gaining the experience that will prepare them for their own future classrooms. In other words, Trust your professional judgment. This concludes Session 3.